Listen. If you lean close enough to this screen right now, you might hear it. The faint whisper of a name never spoken aloud. The echo of tiny footsteps that should have never been erased. There's a place they don't want you to know about. Blackthorn Asylum. A grim fortress hidden behind tangled oaks, where 19 orphans vanished in just 9 months. No records, no graves. Just silence thick enough to choke you. But silence can't hold forever, because tonight you and we're going to crack open that rotten door they sealed a century ago. You didn't come here for comfort. You came here to stand where cowards turn back, to taste the truth they buried beneath the floorboards, where even priests feared to kneel. So brace yourself. This isn't a story for bedtime. It's a wake-up call for men ready to taste the poison of history and come out harder than the stone that marked Blackthorn's gates. You feel that pull in your spine? That's the part of you they tried to keep asleep. Good. Let it wake. Let it burn. Because once you hear what happened inside those walls, you'll never trust the shining saints and spotless ledgers again. You'll know how easily an institution can become a wolf's den, how smiles can mask hunger that feeds on the helpless. And you'll see how that same hunger lives on, not just in dusty archives, but in the halls of power that tell you what's best for you today. Blackthorn Asylum was more than an orphanage. It was a training ground for monsters. And what they did there didn't die with the last brick that fell. The shadows in your city, the hidden agreements, the polite smiles in boardrooms. They all trace back to places like Blackthorn, places where the innocent were currency and the men of God became merchants of despair. Tonight you'll understand, and when you do, you'll carry that stain like a mark of power. A brand that says, I know what you've done, and I'm not afraid to see behind your holy curtain. Take my hand. We go in now. No way back. Step with me into the rot. Blackthorn Asylum squats on a forgotten rise outside New Salem, Pennsylvania, built in 1872, wrapped in iron gates and righteous intentions. A sanctuary for the unwanted, they called it. But behind its brick skin festered something older than charity. The Blackthorn family who funded it were industrial barons, coal, iron, shipping, the sort of men who believed suffering could be harvested for profit, if not salvation. And they built this house of healing right atop a limestone cavern locals whispered about for generations. The cavern's mouth lay sealed, but miners who broke stone beneath claimed they heard crying from the depths. That's the devil's tithe, one old foreman warned. Stone remembers blood, and Blackthorn would feed it plenty. In its first year, the asylum filled with 78 children, Irish, Italian, Polish, orphans of plague, mine collapse, factory fires. Souls discarded by the machine of progress. The Blackthorns, in polished top hats and lace collars, called it charitable investment. And on ledgers it looked holy, feeding, clothing, schooling. But no one recorded what happened when night fell. No one dared question the robed figures who walked the halls with keys on silver chains. Because in the dark, charity rotted into experiment. Discipline blurred into torture, and faith twisted into ritual. Blackthorn didn't want children healed. It wanted children molded, minds scrubbed of past, hearts stripped of rebellion, bodies trained to obey. You see, broken things don't resist, they serve. And 19 of them, they served in ways too final to return. Think about it. What makes a child vanish without a trace? Not a runaway, not a sickness, but a design. A machinery of silence so complete that even whispers fade. Blackthorn was that machine, and it's still running, though the building fell to ruin. Because the men behind, it never left the world stage. They just changed masks. And if you think your age of science and screens is immune, listen closer. You'll hear Blackthorn's echo in every institution that offers you safety, but demands your soul in exchange. The official record says Blackthorn Asylum closed its doors in 1881 after a typhoid outbreak. But even the stone walls themselves remember different screams. Shorter, sharper, final. Because before it shuttered, 19 children were lost. The paperwork says, transferred. But no new orphanage ever logged them in. The cemetery holds no graves. Local clergy offer no names at Mass, and every living witness died strangely silent. Old nurses who refused to speak, priests who burned diaries before death. But one letter survived, hidden in a prayer book found decades later in an antique store in Lancaster. Written in a desperate hand by Sister Evelina, dated June the 4th, 1881. I cannot bear the screams in the cellar. Father Merrin says the pain is purification, but they do not return after. The Blackthorn heirs come at night with boxes of ledgers, and the air smells of iron and blood. May God forgive us. I hear them calling my name now. That single scrap ignites the truth. These children weren't lost. They were sacrificed, not to a God of heaven, but to something older, buried deep under Blackthorn stone. Picture it. Candlelit halls, cold limestone sweating beneath the asylum, rigid men in clerical collars and silk cravats chanting Latin prayers twisted into bargaining words. And in the center, terrified children, chosen not by age, but by something darker. Bloodline, birthmark, or simply because they'd break the easiest. The men called it the Concord. A pact promising power, influence, and immunity from scandal, if they paid the price in innocent suffering. And here's the bitter truth. The pact worked. The Blackthorn dynasty exploded in wealth after those months of vanished orphans. Contracts, shipping monopolies, political favors. A family once near ruin became untouchable. You see? Sacrifice isn't superstition, it's currency. And the truly powerful have always been willing to spend lives not their own. Let's tear back the veil of charity. Blackthorn Asylum wasn't built to save children. It was built to process them, break them into usable pieces, bodies for labor, minds for experiments, blood for ritual. The records left behind, scraps of shipping logs, hidden diaries, speak in codes, but some meanings bleed through. 19 units processed, June-March. Compliance assured. Units. Not boys. Not girls. Units. Imagine being 9 years old, eyes still wet with the memory of your mother's funeral, shipped like livestock into echoing stone halls. Your name stripped, replaced with a number. Daytime. Drills, prayers, forced confessions. Nighttime. Darkness thick with whispers you can't understand. Footsteps that stop outside your door. And when the keys turn, hope drains faster than the last candle. That was life in Blackthorn. The strong were broken. The broken were taken. And the taken were never spoken of again. Why 19? Because that was the agreed tithe in the Concord's hidden clause. 19 pure souls in exchange for 19 years of prosperity. And when those years ended, the Blackthorn family quietly arranged new charities, new homes for wayward children to keep the blood price paid. This is the pattern you'll see once your eyes open. Institution, ritual, sacrifice, reward. And always, silence enforced by fear, shame, or sudden death. This isn't ancient horror. This is modern strategy. The world you know was built on bones just like these. And men who'd trade a child's life for a signature still walk our marble halls. You want to see their faces. Look for those who speak of salvation, yet grow rich from suffering. Who build cathedrals from donations, but hide ledgers no auditor can touch. Their power doesn't come from votes or laws. It comes from centuries of concords, each signed in blood no one dares name. History books won't say it. They'll blame fever, famine, or bureaucratic oversight. But ask yourself, Why did every ledger keeper, every priest, every nurse who handled Blackthorn's records die mysteriously or vanish? A fire in the diocesan archive, a drowned scribe in the Monongahela, a nurse found hanged in her attic with a page stuffed in her mouth. Coincidence? No. Containment, because truth is more dangerous than plague. And what was so dangerous? That the 19 weren't random. Hidden correspondence reveals the chilling calculus. Each child matched a date, a lunar phase, an astrological house. The Concord demanded precision. These weren't poor unfortunates. They were ingredients. Their suffering timed to fuel a working older than the Blackthorn name, and that's why even their graves were denied. The ritual required obliteration. No marker, no prayer, no memory left to anchor them to this world. Only then the Concord promised, would the family's claim on power be absolute. Think on that. An entire machine of faith, charity and law, turned not to save souls, but to erase them. And once you see this pattern at Blackthorn, you'll see it everywhere. Files sealed for the good of the church, scandals hushed to protect the faithful, victims silenced by shame and gold. This is how power maintains itself, not by strength alone, but by manufactured forgetting. But here's where the darkness becomes instruction. Once you see the mechanism, you can use it, not for evil, but to defend, to question, to dismantle. Awareness is the first heresy they fear most, because an awakened mind can't be herded back into silence. And you, yes, you, have already stepped too far to ever go back. They called it St. Thaddeus Hall, but its heart was anything but saintly. Beneath the stone chapel, Father Merrin and the Concord gathered every new moon. Witnesses? None who lived. But fragments remain. A page from a torn journal, a rusted knife etched with 19 notches, and the legend whispered by the town's oldest families. The stone drank their fear. Imagine the ritual, the flicker of tallow candles staining frescoed saints with dancing shadows, hooded men chanting in bastard Latin, voices weaving intention into power, and at the center, a child forced to kneel, trembling so hard the iron collar rattled on the stone. The prayer, not for the child's soul, for the family's fortune, for the institution's prestige, for the power to remain unchallenged. That's the heart of it. Sacrifice, not to serve faith, but to feed ambition. In those final moments, the child's terror wasn't the point. It was the fuel. Despair distilled into power. The darker the fear, the sweeter the reward. That's why the Concord took orphans, children already cracked by loss, easy to break fully. And they knew the cost. These 19 would not return, even in memory. Yet it worked. The ledgers swell with donations, the family lands expand, and even local bishops begin speaking of Blackthorn in hushed, reverent tones. The Concord didn't ask for belief. It demanded obedience and payment in pain. And in return, immunity from law, protection from scandal, generations of influence. And here's the lesson they never wanted you to learn. It wasn't magic in the childish sense. It was a transaction. Belief weaponized, fear monetized. The Concord isn't unique to Blackthorn. Variations exist in every institution built to appear benevolent but designed to control. And once you spot the symbols, you'll see the same blueprint from ruined abbeys to shining glass towers today. Let's talk about why the Concord feared discovery so much. Power built on blood can't survive daylight. Their ritual demanded that no one outside the circle could ever speak of it, under pain of death, ruin, or madness. That's why every record was burned, every diary destroyed, every whisper traced back to its source. But a few words escaped, scrawled in the trembling hand of Sister Evelina before she was sent away for exhaustion. "They come for the marked children," she wrote. "They say the stone must be fed." What were these marks? Witnesses described them. Birthmarks shaped like crescent moons, extra digits, a strange scar at the hairline. To the Concord, these weren't deformities. They were keys. Keys that unlocked the full price of the pact. The ritual demanded the chosen victims be unclaimed. No family to mourn, no parish to demand answers. Orphans were perfect. They belonged to no one, and in the eyes of the law, they vanished without a ripple. 19 lost souls, each mapped to a symbol in the Concord's hidden grimoire. This isn't folklore. This is the practical face of evil. Build an institution, wrap it in faith, and use it as a veil for selection and disappearance. And it worked. Because no one dared accuse the men of God. Even today, power still hides behind charity. The public face beams goodwill. The hidden hand moves quietly, feeding the same ancient hunger. Remember this. Secrecy isn't just for protection. It's the fuel that keeps the engine of corruption running. Silence starves memory, and memory is the only force that can break a Concord's power. And tonight, by hearing this, you become part of that living memory. Dangerous, yes, but necessary, because what they fear most is that someone remembers. You might ask, why 19? Why not 20 or 50? Because every Concord isn't mere madness. It's architecture, numbers, symbols, and cosmic contracts older than scripture. In the hidden scroll the Blackthorn heirs guarded, the number 19 held weight, one for each lunar cycle in the ancient Metonic calendar, binding the pact not to years, but to the moon's dominion over tides, madness, and blood. Think of it. Each vanished orphan tied to a single cycle, their fear and death offered up to keep the family's dominion unbroken for 19 lunar years. After that, the Concord had to be renewed, or the Blackthorn's power would begin to decay. And so the cycle repeated, generation after generation, while the town above saw nothing but black carriages coming and going by night. Most of us today think these men prayed to the Christian God, but the Concord's prayers twisted older invocations, dark rites stolen from folk cults in the Carpathians, whispered by traders who trafficked not only in spices and silk, but in forbidden words. This isn't a medieval horror. This is modern business wearing holy robes. Every blessing the Blackthorns claimed, trade routes, coal contracts, political alliances, was purchased with a child's agony. And when you see a dynasty that blooms overnight while competitors crumble, don't ask what they know. Ask who they buried in the foundation. Because in the end, the real power was never in relics or candles, but in the willingness to do what others could not stomach, sacrifice the truly innocent. And here's the sharper edge of that truth. The men who signed Concords didn't do so because they were monsters. They did it because it worked. Power obeys no morality but the law of exchange. Life for wealth, silence for protection. And once you understand that, you'll stop asking why, and start asking who signs the Concord today. We've spoken of ritual, but not yet of the Blackthorn children themselves, the hearts that were broken to build this empire of blood. The archive gives us fragments. A girl named Claire, no older than 8, with hair pale as winter wheat, and eyes that never lifted from the floor. A boy called Aidan, who stuttered so fiercely he could barely speak his own name. They were chosen because they were meek, unnoticed, unlikely to be missed even by the nuns charged to protect them. But Sister Evelina's letter records something chilling. In the final weeks, even the children who weren't chosen began to sense what was coming. They grew silent, clung to each other at night, and prayed until their lips bled. The shadow of terror fell across the dormitory like winter fog. Some tried to run, caught at the iron gates, dragged back under torchlight, their sobs echoing through stone halls. And when the 19 were finally processed, the survivors were forced to watch the empty beds remain unfilled, day after day, month after month. This was part of the Concord's design, not only to harvest suffering from the chosen, but to seed lifelong fear in the rest, ensuring silence. Think about this. The Blackthorn heirs didn't just want power. They wanted obedience baked into the bones of the next generation, and they got it. The few survivors who lived into adulthood never spoke publicly. Some ended their lives in asylums. Some drank themselves to death. A few left diaries we now piece together. But none ever escaped the shadow cast by those empty beds. That's the cruelest part of institutional evil. Its victims often become its living proof and its most loyal protectors, too broken to speak, too haunted to forget. And this is how silence persists, not only from those in power, but from those crushed beneath it. Let me ask you this. If 19 orphans can vanish without scandal, what else might the Concord have done while polite society looked away? We have hints. Shipments labelled clerical supplies, leaving Blackthorn at night. Freight records that don't match the asylum's needs, and anonymous letters hinting at flesh sent east. Most historians dismiss these as rumour, but ask yourself, why would men willing to kill 19 children for power stop there? Why not profit further? The Concord was not just a ritual, it was a network. Merchants, priests, judges, all bound by shared guilt and shared reward. And if you think they limited themselves to blood spilled in basements, you don't yet understand human greed. One letter, unsigned, found decades later in a judge's estate, speaks plainly. The children are pliant and bring a fine price. The families who purchase ask no questions, and neither must we. That word, purchase, not adoption, not charity, a transaction, plain as iron. And what of the Blackthorn heirs? Their investments bloomed in the very years children vanished. New shipping routes opened, rival companies crumbled, and state contracts flowed like wine. Coincidence? Or the Concord's reward? Here's the hardest truth. The men who sat in pews each Sunday, who smiled at city councils and donated to hospitals, were the same men who oversaw these disappearances. They could reconcile horror and respectability because the Concord taught them the oldest lie. The ends justify the means. Once you see this mechanism, you'll never look at power the same. And you shouldn't. Because even today, in glass towers and marble courts, men in tailored suits sign concords of their own, not always in blood, but always at someone else's expense. It's time you hear about the cellar itself, the place they called the Stone Room. Built below the asylum's chapel, lined with limestone older than memory. Witnesses spoke of a smell that never left it, iron, mould, and something sourer, fear that soaked the walls. Sister Evelina's final pages described flickering lanterns revealing symbols scratched into the stone. Circles, crescents, knives, and the Blackthorn family crest defaced to form a kind of sigil. Here, they said, the Concord's price was collected. 1 child per lunar cycle, each marked and prepared by men of faith who twisted prayers into incantations. Picture it, a priest's robe brushing across wet stone, hands trembling as they pour wine black as night, whispering words they barely dare to understand. And the child, shaking, barefoot, eyes darting for an escape that never comes. The ritual didn't need belief from the victim, only terror. Fear was the currency, and the men who led it? Some believed, some didn't, but all agreed on this. The ritual worked. That room claimed 19 souls, but it birthed something worse. The Blackthorn Concord itself, a living idea, passed through family and clergy, shaping each generation. Even when the walls crumbled decades later, survivors swore they still heard faint cries in the rubble at night. Because trauma imprints itself, not only on minds, but on places. And that is why the cellar door was bricked up after the closure, but never truly forgotten. When the building was demolished in 1939, workers found a single blackened candlestick and a rusted chain driven into the floor. What they didn't find were bones, because the Concord required obliteration. Nothing left to bury, nothing left to mourn. To this day, the land where the stone room lay remains empty, fenced off by developers citing unstable ground. But you and I know the real reason. Some stains sink too deep into the earth to ever build over, and some truths live longer than stone. Now let's step back and ask why Blackthorn's horror stayed hidden. Was it only secrecy, or something deeper? You see, the true genius of the Concord was its plausible deniability. No single man saw the whole machine. Priests only knew their prayers. Blackthorn heirs signed donations, never purchases, and civic leaders saw only what they wanted, a respected family funding an orphanage that kept street children off the alleys. Power protects itself through layers. If scandal surfaces, it blames a single bad actor. A priest gone mad, a nurse who drank too much, a cleric who misfiled records. The Concord knew. So long as the public never saw the pattern, it would never see the crime. And what of the townspeople? Many suspected. Some saw wagons leaving by night, children missing from the yard by morning. But suspicion without proof is no match for a family that feeds your economy, funds your churches, and shapes your politics. Those who asked too loudly found careers ended, reputations ruined, or accidents waiting in the dark. Fear did the rest. Fear that speaking out might curse your family. Fear that the church itself might excommunicate you, in an age when that meant social death. And perhaps the deepest fear, what if it's true? What if the men we trust most do these things? Easier to look away, to whisper over beer, to tell yourself the children ran away. This is the real Concord, not merely a pact among the powerful, but a silent agreement among everyone else not to see. And this pact repeats itself, century after century. Today, scandals break and fade. Names are whispered and forgotten. Because even now, fear and complicity keep the machine oiled. But you're still here, still listening. That means the Concord's spell is breaking, at least in you, and that is dangerous, for them, and for you. We must speak now of the doctrine the Concord whispered into each generation of Blackthorn heirs. Sacrifice grants dominion. In simple words, to rule others, first offer up the innocent. This wasn't a metaphor, it was instruction. The diaries reveal how this belief shaped their empire. They bought coal mines and forced orphans into them. They opened textile mills where girls as young as 7 worked until their fingers bled. Each new venture, each new acquisition, accompanied by a fresh donation to the Concord's cause, and always prosperity followed. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a worldview. That power does not bloom from kindness, but from controlled brutality, and the family lived by it. The patriarchs beat their own sons to steal them. Daughters were married off in bargains that benefited the house. Every gesture of mercy was calculated. Every act of charity hid a ledger entry. When you see headlines today about corporations crushing competitors or foundations spending millions but asking billions in loyalty, know this: it is the same doctrine, adapted to the age of suits and screens. The form changes, the formula remains. What makes the Concord so enduring isn't ritual alone. It is the will to do what others dare not, to trade innocence for gain. And the chilling part, many heirs felt guilt and did it anyway. Because once you benefit from blood, you convince yourself it's necessary, that the price is justified. And if you think this is ancient history, look around. Industries that exploit children still flourish. Power still buys silence. And every time we look away, we become part of the Concord's living covenant. The innocent will pay, so we can remain comfortable. But you who hear these words, now carry the stain of knowledge. You can't plead ignorance. You can only choose what to do next. Let's step deeper into the Blackthorn Concord's philosophy. Suffering wasn't merely necessary, it was sacred. They believed agony purified power, transforming raw greed into something unassailable. And they justified this with twisted theology, that God himself sacrificed his Son, so lesser men might follow the same pattern in smaller, darker ways. This is how horror becomes tradition. Fathers taught sons to see the world not as a field to cultivate, but as an altar to feed. And each generation handed down the Blackthorn grimoire, bound in cracked leather, its pages stained by candle soot and human oil. It recorded not only the 19 names, or what little they knew, but also lunar tables, ritual instructions, and chilling notes. Pain must be fresh, fear must be real, hope must be crushed before offering. They didn't ask if it was evil. They asked only if it worked. And it did. The family survived wars, depressions, revolutions, while competitors fell. Even when public scandals brushed against them, consequences never reached the heart of the Blackthorn power. The Concord was not superstition, but an operating manual for power. Choose victims no one will protect. Mask horror behind holiness. Destroy every witness or memory. And remember, the greater the sacrifice, the longer the dominion. Think carefully on that last lesson. Because even outside Blackthorn, the world still follows it. Governments justify torture to protect the many. Corporations destroy communities for quarterly gains. And always the victims are voiceless, the poor, the foreign, the unseen. This isn't ancient darkness. It is modern policy. And the question isn't whether the Concord survives, but how many wear its mask today. Because once power learns blood buys immunity, it never forgets. It merely changes form. You, by hearing this, stand at a crossroads. Pretend you never learned, or see the pattern everywhere. And seeing means responsibility. Because what is known can no longer be denied. It's time to speak of the 19, not as units, not as tithes, but as children who lived, felt, feared. Their names are mostly lost, but a few scrawled by Sister Evelina survive. Claire, Aidan, Elspeth, Jonah, Thomas, Ruth. Imagine them, coughing through damp winters, clutching each other under thin blankets, jumping at every footstep. Their terror wasn't abstract. It was nightly, breathing down their necks. They saw friends vanish. A bed stripped bare by morning, no explanation, only new prayers muttered by the priests. The ritual required that they know enough to fear, but not enough to flee. So the Concord kept them just hopeful enough. Promises of adoption, letters from imaginary families. Each letter, written in the same cleric's hand, was an instrument of control. Hope kept them compliant. Hopelessness fueled the final ritual. We must remember them as more than victims. They resisted in small ways, scratching symbols into bedposts, whispering warnings to younger children, hiding bread for runaways. Their resistance failed, crushed by a machinery older and more ruthless than childhood bravery. But it mattered, because memory itself is defiance. That's why the Concord demanded obliteration, so no one could even name them. Names anchor memory. Memory seeds outrage, outrage threatens power, and so their names were burned and their faces erased. Yet here, in this telling, they live again, if only in fragments. And that is the first blow against the Concord's greatest defense, forgetting. Because the true horror isn't that 19 children died. It's that their deaths were meant to vanish completely. And the greatest justice we can offer them even now is this. Remember, why did Blackthorn target orphans? The Concord's notes are blunt. Unclaimed souls are best. No kin to mourn, no parish to question. Practical evil always chooses victims least defended. Beyond mere convenience, there was something darker,
the belief that unanchored children held raw spiritual potency. The rituals theory claimed suffering is strongest when the victim clings to no one, no family, no faith, no community. A solitary child's terror, they taught, rises unbound to feed the pact. Think of the monstrous cunning here. Build an institution that appears merciful, gather the most vulnerable, and harvest their fear in secret. And it worked. Witnesses spoke of the Blackthorn patriarch's words. The coin of the realm is pain unspoken. And because the children had no surnames, no property, no lineage, society barely counted them as human. If they vanished, official records offered bland lines: transferred, relocated, deceased, unspecified illness. And in a world where childhood mortality was common, few asked further. But understand, this was not random brutality. It was industrialized, ritualized, institutionalized. The Concord refined it, recorded what produced best results. Younger children, but old enough to grasp their doom. Illnesses untreated to keep them weak. Isolation before the ritual to deepen despair. This is the face of true evil. Cold, methodical, dressed in clerical robes and administrative ledgers. And it is why, centuries later, we must not comfort ourselves by calling them monsters. Monsters are aberrations. These men were respected, decorated, and obeyed. Evil does not hide in shadows. It kneels at altars, chairs boards, and drafts policy, always with a reason, always with a ledger to prove necessity. And once you see that, you'll never mistake its face again. You may wonder, did no one try to stop this? The answer is tragic. A few did, and they paid the price. Sister Evelina, whose trembling notes we've quoted, was among them. She wrote, "I begged Father Merrin to spare the youngest. He smiled and called me sentimental." Her letters speak of two more. Brother Matthias, a monk assigned to the asylum's gardens, who gathered scraps of rumor and kept a hidden journal, and Nurse Margaret, who dared question the nightly special treatments. Neither lived to testify. Matthias was found dead in the well, ruled misadventure. Margaret died of a sudden fever, though townsfolk whispered of poison. The Concord's brilliance lay in how it controlled not only the institution, but also the entire local network: constables, judges, and clergy. Any dissent became a private tragedy, never a public scandal. A silent purge, so neat the town could pretend nothing happened. The ritual was only the visible horror. The real engine of the Concord was fear, carefully planted, cultivated, and harvested. Even townspeople outside the asylum learned, ask too many questions, and tragedy might visit your family. This is how corruption survives, not through endless violence, but through a few carefully chosen, very public silences. Each time someone vanished, or fell ill, or was discredited, it sent a ripple of terror far beyond Blackthorn's walls. And so even the decent stayed quiet, telling themselves, "It isn't my child. It isn't my fight." The Concord counted on this, and still does, because the pattern survives. In every institution where good people see evil, yet remain silent for fear of ruin, you see Blackthorn's legacy. And in every generation, there are always a few, like Evelina, who speak anyway. They rarely survive, but their words, if they slip through, can break centuries of silence. And today, by reading these fragments, you carry her defiance forward. That, too, is power. The 19 vanished children weren't just victims. They became currency in a ritual economy. The Concord scrolls describe each child's alignment, paired with dates, lunar nodes, and, disturbingly, elements of their suffering. Claire, waning moon, water, dread of confinement. Jonah, full moon, fire, terror of abandonment. The point wasn't random cruelty. It was precision engineering of fear.
The Concord believed each child's unique terror could unlock different doors to influence: wealth, fertility, invincibility against rivals. The diaries call it the calculus of pain. Read that phrase again. It reveals the coldest truth. The Concord didn't kill for pleasure. They killed for results. And they tested, adjusted, refined. Just as modern corporations optimize ads or factories optimize labor. This is why we can't dismiss the Concord as medieval madness. Their methods are horrifyingly modern. Gather data, iterate, improve. Evil industrialized. And they succeeded. The Blackthorn dynasty's rise is written in ledgers, contracts, and shipping manifests. But what they feared most wasn't exposure. It was failure. Because if the ritual ever failed, all their power might collapse. That fear kept them fanatical. Each successor trained to protect the pact. Each generation tasked to find new units when the previous tithe expired. Even after the asylum closed, the diaries hint the Concord simply moved. New orphanages, new charities, same ledger entries under different names. Some records mention shipments to the coast, even to distant colonies. Children traded for goods, favors, or silence. This is horror not of shadows, but of bureaucratic horror. Rows of numbers that hide screams behind ink. And the lesson? Wherever you see human suffering reduced to data, to quotas, to units, Blackthorn's spirit still walks. One might ask, where did the ritual come from? Blackthorn didn't invent it. They inherited it. Family letters mention an ancestor, Alistair Blackthorn, who travelled Eastern Europe in the early 1700s. He returned with new doctrines, black-bound texts in strange dialects, and a quiet conviction that suffering could bend fortune. These texts, never fully translated, hint at older cults, worshippers of entities they called the kindly ones, or the silent choir. Not demons in the Christian sense, but ancient forces that hear terror, taste fear, and return favor. What did Blackthorn offer these forces? The rawest terror, a child, alone, certain death is coming, and no hope of rescue. And what did they receive? Coincidence becomes certainty, luck bends, rivals die, minds flourish. The Concord formalized this exchange. 19 chosen victims, 1 per lunar cycle, and silence absolute. And here lies the darkest genius. The men who led it didn't need to believe in the kindly ones. They needed only to believe in results. Faith became irrelevant. The mechanism worked. That's why it survived enlightenment, revolutions, modernity. Because the pact was never about faith. It was about transaction. And as long as men wanted power badly enough to pay, the ritual endured. Even when the original scrolls vanished in a fire, descendants rebuilt them from memory. Because power rooted in blood doesn't die when paper burns. It survives in whispered instructions, in secret gatherings, in the willingness to cross a line others won't. And today, do you truly think the desire for unearned power has vanished? Or merely changed masks? Some doubt the Concord's power. They ask, how could such horror grant real-world wealth? The answer lies not in magic, but in networked corruption. By binding dozens of powerful men into shared guilt, the Concord created something priceless, an unbreakable alliance. Each participant had blood on his hands, so none dared betray the others. Together, they controlled trade, law, and rumor. Ensuring contracts flowed to Blackthorn ships, rivals were ruined by scandal, and investigations died quietly. In other words, the ritual didn't summon literal demons, though some believed it did. It summoned co-conspirators willing to protect each other at any cost, and the price was 19 lives every cycle. Here's what the diaries reveal. The power wasn't supernatural alone. It was the strength of men united by secrets too dark to confess. Once you hold such a secret, you cannot leave. The Concord's greatest magic was mutual blackmail. And this pattern survives. Modern scandals show the same shape. A core crime so monstrous that every witness becomes complicit, and silence becomes the only protection. This is why the Concord feared discovery more than damnation. Exposure would shatter the network, destroy fortunes, and perhaps worse, leave them vulnerable to the very rivals they once crushed. So remember, the most dangerous force isn't ritual. It's shared guilt that locks men together across decades. And once you see that pattern, you see Blackthorn not as an aberration, but as a blueprint for power itself. What of the 19 souls, once offered? Diaries hint at the most chilling promise the Concord whispered to itself, that the children would not only be obliterated, but bound to serve the family's fortune in death. They called it the choir invisible, the idea that pure terror at the moment of death makes a soul malleable, able to be tethered. In the Concord's words, fear unending for them becomes favor unending for us. The children's restless spirits weren't expected to rise against them, but to haunt rivals, curse competitors, and shield the family line. If this sounds like superstition, remember, these were men of wealth and law who wrote contracts about ghosts. Their ledgers list costs for choir maintenance, candles, offerings, sealed rooms where family heirs petitioned the dead for favor before business deals or elections. Survivors spoke of cold spots in Blackthorn's halls, of shadows lingering by doorways, of children's cries echoing from sealed basements. And every heir, even those who doubted, still paid homage. Better to honor restless servants than risk their wrath. It was said the family chapel kept 19 black candles, each marked with a name no outsider ever learned. And when a Blackthorn heir fell ill, they burned these candles, chanting the old prayers brought back from the East. Was it real? Did restless spirits truly guard the family's fortune? Or did belief itself, and the ruthlessness it justified, keep the dynasty alive? Perhaps the truth matters less than the effect. Every generation acted as if it were real. And so, in fear and blood, the Blackthorn name endured. Even now, ruins of the chapel still bear faint soot marks where those candles once stood. And sometimes at night, townsfolk say you can hear faint childlike singing rising from the broken stones. A choir meant to bless, now only mourns. Let's leave the stone halls and speak of what happened after. When Blackthorn Asylum finally closed in 1881, the Concord did not die. It adapted. The family redirected its charity into new ventures: orphan trains to distant states, homes for wayward girls, reformatories far from curious towns. Each institution kept the same structure: private ownership, clerical oversight, and a separate secret ledger. Why? Because the ritual's heart, 19 victims every lunar cycle, had become the cost of doing business. And as the dynasty grew, so did its hunger. One ledger fragment from 1904 lists units 24, compliance insured. 24, the tithe had risen. The Blackthorn heirs became financiers, politicians, industrialists. But behind polished speeches lay the same old machinery: suffering exchanged for protection and power. Even in the 20th century, whispers followed them: missing migrant children, sudden fires destroying records, inspectors dying in accidents. Yet still, the public saw only grand buildings, hospitals built in their name, scholarships for the poor. The family learned, the brighter the public charity, the darker the secret could remain. And this is why Blackthorn isn't a ghost story. It's a template. The Concord didn't fade with gaslight and cobblestone. It moved into marble lobbies, corporate boards, think tanks. The pattern? Find the vulnerable, break them unseen, and use their silence to bind accomplices. This isn't past tense. Institutions still vanish the inconvenient. Companies still crush whistleblowers. And the same grim logic applies. Better 19 innocents perish than one dynasty fall. Once you see this, you understand why the Concord lasted centuries. Because it wasn't about faith or even ritual, it was about willingness to do what decent men refuse. And that willingness, cold, calculating, generational, is power's oldest inheritance.
Here is the paradox the Blackthorn Concord understood. People are less afraid of evil than they are of meaninglessness. A random tragedy horrifies. A purposeful tragedy, even monstrous, can be rationalized. By wrapping murder in ritual, they gave it purpose, a cosmic why that heirs and accomplices could cling to. We suffer them to suffer no more, as one patriarch wrote. Their pain secures 100-fold good. In the Concord's logic, the 19 became martyrs for family and faith. This sanctified the unspeakable, allowing each generation to see itself not as monsters, but as guardians of fortune, men and women who bore the burden of necessary sin. That's the genius of ritualized evil. It doesn't erase conscience, it corrupts it. Participants stop asking, "Is this right?" and instead ask, "Is this enough?" And once you've accepted the premise that suffering can be currency, the rest follows. Even the devout among them did not reject the pact. They simply recast it as sacrifice demanded by Providence. And when doubt surfaced, the family legend answered, "Do you want the mines to flood? The ships to sink? The children's sacrifice protects all our children." And so, silence became a virtue. Doubt became betrayal. And those who still wept at night learned to do so quietly behind locked doors. This is why Blackthorn's horror survived generations, not by crushing every conscience, but by bending conscience until it served the ritual. And once the mind accepts atrocity as duty, the body will follow. Ask yourself where today's rituals hide, and whose silence keeps them alive. Because the shape of evil hasn't changed, only the words we use to excuse it. The Concord demanded more than 19 lives. It demanded an entire system. Watchers, enforcers, scribes, each played a part, each bound by shared guilt. The watchers were priests and nuns who chose which children were suitable, or frail, lonely, easily broken. They recorded nightmares, tracked illnesses, and decided who would vanish. The enforcers kept silence. Guards, local constables, family loyalists. They found runaways, quieted rumors, and sometimes killed inconvenient witnesses. The scribes kept the ledgers, cold columns of numbers that hid horror behind ink. Units processed, units transferred. These men knew the most, yet often slept best. Distance by language became their shield. None did these tasks openly. Each had a public face, the gentle priest, the dutiful clerk, the kind constable, and each told themselves they were only a small cog, not responsible for the whole. But here is where the Concord's true strength lay. Even the lowest clerk knew just enough to be dangerous. Silence was ensured by mutual threat. Betray, and you damn not only yourself, but everyone you know. This network made the Concord resilient. It didn't matter if a single priest wavered, the system replaced him. The ritual survived because the structure itself protected it. And that too survives. In modern scandals, blame often stops at a single bad actor, but the machinery that enabled them remains untouched. The Concord teaches, the crime isn't only in the act, but in the network that plans, hides, and benefits, and unless we dismantle that machinery, new Blackthorns will always rise. When the asylum finally fell into disuse, townsfolk whispered it was cursed. Some swore they saw figures at broken windows. Others heard weeping where no one lived. Even skeptics avoided the grounds after sunset. Why? Because places remember. The stone walls soaked centuries of terror, prayers twisted into bargains, and deaths unwept. And fear itself leaves a trace. Workers tasked with dismantling the chapel in 1939 recorded strange accidents. Tools vanished, lanterns shattered. A mason fell and broke his leg after swearing he saw a child watching from a stairwell. Logs note persistent drafts and noises. Superstition? Perhaps. But trauma imprints. Just as a battlefield feels different from a garden, the asylum felt wrong.
and the few who dared spend nights within often fled by dawn, pale and silent. The land was sold, resold, abandoned. Developers blamed unstable foundations. Locals blamed something deeper. 19 restless souls denied even the mercy of burial. And what of the Blackthorn family? By mid-century their power waned, but never truly vanished. They diversified, modernized, and quietly erased old ledgers. Yet whispers followed them, strange deaths, sudden misfortunes, striking those who threatened exposure. And so, even as modernity wrapped the ruins in new roads and power lines, the heart of the Concord survived. Secrecy enforced by fear, wealth insulated by guilt. Some say at the ruins today you still hear faint singing. 19 voices, neither living nor fully dead. A reminder that horror-denied justice becomes not silence, but an echo that never ends. How did the Concord finally fracture? Not by justice, but by entropy and pride. By the 1960s, younger heirs doubted the ritual. Some called it superstitious relic. But older members clung to it, not out of faith, but fear of what might happen if they stopped. Division weakened them. Rival families, corporations, and politicians sensed opportunity. The world changed. Media grew bolder, old networks of silence frayed, and a few ledgers leaked into the wrong hands. In 1974, a fire destroyed part of the family archives. Official cause: faulty wiring. Rumor claims it was set by a frightened heir trying to sever the past. But it was too late. Fragments survived, scattered through collectors, historians, and families once bound to the Concord. Exposure didn't come from a hero. It came from gradual erosion. Whispers turned to rumors, rumors to newspaper stories, stories to investigations. Names once sacred became liabilities. Assets were quietly sold. Titles vanished into shell companies. But true justice never arrived. No heir stood trial. No official confession was given. The Concord dissolved not by reckoning, but by rebranding. And its knowledge, the calculus of pain, slipped into other hands, other institutions. Here's the cruel truth. Evil rarely dies. It mutates. What began as ritual sacrifice became corporate exploitation, policy decisions, and silent complicity. The logic endures. The powerless must pay so the powerful endure. And the Blackthorn name? Scrubbed from buildings, merged into new conglomerates, memorialized as philanthropists. The Concord's bones still lie beneath, even if the face changed. If you've stayed with this story, you may ask, why remember? Isn't it better to let the past rot? Because forgetting is the Concord's final victory. Its power always relied on secrecy, but even more on the world's desire not to know. When we remember, we do more than mourn victims. We see the blueprint, how power uses fear, guilt, and ritual to sustain itself. We see how decent people become cogs in monstrous machines. And most importantly, we see that the same pattern repeats, in different clothes, different names. History doesn't repeat itself identically, but it rhymes. Wherever children vanish without investigation, wherever ledgers hide human suffering, wherever guilt becomes a bond stronger than law, there the Concord walks again. Remembering is painful, but it is also power. Once named, darkness loses part of its hold. Memory becomes warning, and the question it demands, what do we do now? Because the Concord spirit survives wherever we weigh human life on a ledger, excuse cruelty as necessity, or silence truth for comfort. The Blackthorn heirs may be gone, but the logic they perfected still governs boardrooms, governments, and institutions. And the first step to breaking it is this: refuse to look away. Perhaps you still doubt. You ask, were there really 19 children? Did rituals truly buy power? Skepticism is wise. The records are fragmented, the diaries partial, some witnesses unreliable. But focus on what is undisputed. 19 children vanished without proper records. Blackthorn's wealth and influence surged precisely as these disappearances peaked. Investigations died quietly. Evidence vanished. Witnesses perished in accidents. Survivors spoke before dying of ritual, fear, and guilt. These facts alone reveal something monstrous, whether or not the ritual worked. The horror was real, the pain was real, and the profits were real. We mustn't be trapped by the question of magic. Whether the pact summoned dark forces or merely bound men by guilt, the result was the same, an empire built on children's bones. And that ultimately is the lesson the Concord teaches. Belief may drive horror, but it is action, deliberate, organized, generational, that sustains it. So the question isn't, did it work? The question is, why were so many willing to do it for so long? And why in every era do others build new Concords by different names? Let us return once more to the 19, not as numbers, but as lost voices. They were children, small, frightened, wanting nothing more than warmth, safety, and love. Instead, they became objects in a secret ledger, erased to protect men who spoke of God while bartering lives. History rarely names such children. Records called them wards, inmates, units. But traces remain. A lock of hair kept in a nurse's book, initials carved into a wooden bed frame, a prayer half-finished in a torn psalter. These fragments haunt us because they demand we look beyond statistics. The Concord wasn't only about ritual power, it was about dehumanization so complete that the deaths became necessary, reasonable, justified. And this, tragically, is not confined to Blackthorn's stone walls. When society accepts that certain lives matter less because they are poor, voiceless, forgotten, we recreate the same machinery. It may not wear robes or chant prayers, but the logic is unchanged. The greatest horror is not what the Blackthorn Concord did in secret, but what the world around them allowed, excused, and forgot. To remember the 19 is to refuse that forgetting. To speak their names, or even fragments of them, is to deny the Concord's final goal, erasure. If there is justice after so many silent years, it begins here, by giving them back humanity, however partial, however late. And by asking ourselves what we do today, knowingly or not, that echoes the same cruel equation. The last known Concord gathering occurred in 1956 at a decaying coastal estate. Diary fragments suggest panic. The modern world was tightening. Journalists asked dangerous questions. Archives risked discovery. The record notes 13 men and 3 women, heirs and allies, gathered by candlelight, not to renew power, but to discuss survival. For the first time, fear outweighed ambition. Some argued to end the ritual, destroy evidence, and trust fortune to remain. Others, older and more devout, demanded renewal. If we stop, everything dies with us. But fear prevailed. They voted to disperse funds, bury archives, and dissolve the visible face of the Concord. They burned scrolls that night, buried ledgers under broken flagstones, and left before dawn. Yet the idea, the calculus of suffering, did not die. The heirs funneled money into new industries, new charities, each stripped of ritual, yet still thriving on exploitation. Thus the Concord ended not with justice, nor repentance, but transformation. The ancient chant fell silent. The underlying logic lived on. And perhaps that is the final horror. The ritual was never the true power. The real engine was the human willingness to sacrifice the voiceless for gain. A truth so resilient it survives every name, every century. You might ask, what remains now? The asylum is rubble, the chapel's stones scattered, most diaries burned, ledgers lost. Yet fragments endure.
a rusted candlestick blackened by rituals kept in a museum's forgotten drawer. Scorched ledger pages bought at auction, now held by private collectors. Oral histories passed through families whose ancestors served as watchers or scribes. Each fragment alone seems innocuous. Together they sketch a horror that no single fire could erase. And still, the land where the asylum stood remains undeveloped, though it sits in prime territory. Local law insists the ground is unsettled. Builders who tried reported equipment failures, sudden illnesses among crews, and most persistently, dreams of children calling from the earth. Skepticism is natural, but sometimes memory itself becomes the haunting. A history so brutal it refuses to stay buried, demanding someone remember. And in remembering, we hold the Concord's last defense, forgetting, at bay. Because once forgotten, such horror repeats. Once named, it stands as warning. The story of the Blackthorn Concord ends, as all such stories do, in silence, shame, and half-erased ledgers. Yet its real legacy is not merely historical, it is cautionary. The ritual was terrible, but it was only the surface. Beneath lay the doctrine that suffering is a resource, to be refined and spent, that innocence is expendable when power is at stake, that silence is more profitable than justice. This doctrine did not die with the last Blackthorn heir. It thrives wherever human lives are weighed against profit, reputation, or convenience. We like to believe evil is monstrous and obvious. The Concord shows it is often methodical, dressed in piety and charity, speaking calmly of necessity. That is why the story matters. It forces us to see how power can become its own faith, and how decent people can become priests of that faith, offering up the voiceless for its continuation. The only real question the Concord leaves us is chillingly modern. What price do we still accept so our world can remain comfortable?
So we come to the end, a shattered asylum, a family name scrubbed from marble, 19 lost children whose faces few remember. But even now their story whispers, not as a tale of demons or curses, but of human choices, repeated, defended, and hidden. What the Concord built was not merely an empire, but a template. Take the vulnerable, break them, bury them, and profit in the silence. And the only true ritual that breaks such power is memory. To speak what was meant to stay secret, to mourn what was meant to be forgotten, to refuse the bargain that buys comfort at the cost of conscience. If you've listened this far, you now carry that memory, that burden, that choice. The Blackthorn Concord is gone. But in each age, new Concords rise. And the question they ask of each of us remains the same. Will you look away? Or will you name what you see and break the silence?